Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thanks very much. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm going to talk about facilitating next-generation data-intensive science using Semantic Technologies. And this is joint work with my colleague at RPI, Peter Fox, who I've worked with for a number of years when I was at Stanford and he was at NCAR. So I'm going to talk a little bit about building the foundations for semantic eScience, which is a trend that Peter and I have been working on along with our teams for almost a decade now. I came in from the artificial intelligence side, and so my goal is to use artificial intelligence in service of the next generation of science, which I believe, and many people believe, is interdisciplinary, distributed, collaborative eScience. And from a scientist, a natural scientist goal, or actually any scientist goal, we want to enable scientists to access, interact, and collaborate on what looks like a global distributed knowledge base of data that looks like it's integrated, looks like it's locally available, but there's a lot of challenges. When we're working in the natural science world, we're typically getting our data from many different instruments, using a lot of different protocols, using tons of vocabularies. If you were in the room that I was in right before this, we were arguing about vocabularies. Using sometimes unstated assumptions, often inconsistent or evolving metadata, and everything is evolving. Your data is evolving, your metadata is evolving. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to give a few highlights from semantically enabled science efforts that Peter and I have done over the last about 7 years, highlight a couple of things from my team's knowledge provenance efforts, and use both of those to motivate a new project that we just got called the Semantic eScience Framework, which, if you're following the press, RPI wrote a little press announcement about this, and it just took off, I think, because when we were one of the larger efforts that was funded under the American Recovery and ARRA effort, and I provided one link for that, which is basically our next generation effort to make it go beyond any particular science area to do it across many science areas. So an early project that we did was a virtual solar terrestrial observatory. From a computer scientist viewpoint like mine, I'm interested in this because it's an interdisciplinary virtual observatory. And I was working with somebody who did solar and atmospheric research, and so from his perspective, it was great that he and his colleagues could access the data seamlessly, and from my perspective, I helped enable the next generation of science. And our goal was to be a distributed, scalable education and research environment to let scientists do what they typically do, search for data, integrate it, and analyze it. And we were aiming at PhD researchers, which, while ultimately we want to aim at the world, initially it's easier to aim at the PhD researchers because you don't have to do quite as much on your interfaces. This project covers solar terrestrial, and space physics. But as you'll see, the infrastructure has been used in a lot of different science areas. And it provided virtual access. It still provides. It went into service, actually, after less than a year of funding, which I was really happy about. And so it's been up now, I think, for about 4 years. And it was aimed at one interdisciplinary area, solar and solar terrestrial physics. But we've used it in areas including volcanology, atmospheric, climate response, plate tectonics, now oceans, and it's at the basis of a couple of follow-on projects, one of which is the Semantic Provenance Capture and Data Ingest Systems. This is an NSF-funded project that's trying to capture more provenance at the beginning. So considering smart instruments, so the data comes smart, annotated off the instrument, so that you don't have to go back and add provenance after the fact. It starts with a background ontology. Sorry if that's beyond what your eyes allow you to read. But it's got an instrument hierarchy, information about observatories, information about data products, and information about services that get the data. And it turned out that while this was done by a fairly small group, a couple of scientists, natural scientists initially did it, and then we vetted it with larger and larger groups. And although it was aimed in these very specific areas, it turns out that it was very simple to expand it to cover radically different science areas. And now what we're doing now we're kind of in the third generation of this, we're modularizing it and taking out the things that are atmosphere specific or solar terrestrial physics specific and making them in separate modules, and then reusing the infrastructure across general science areas. It uses the background ontology to help filter the information. What was one thing that was really powerful about this system is before, scientists had to come in and do it in a very standard methodology. They always had to start with their dates and then go to the instrument, and they had to know the instrument code, and they had to know the dates. They couldn't say, oh, well, during a period of high geomagnetic activity, which is one thing they wanted to do. They had to know that that was from March 2nd of 2004 to something else. And now you can come in any direction as enabled by the ontology, and you don't have to know where the data resides. The system actually can go out and wrap the calls and pull the data in and integrate it in a way that previously scientists had to do. And also previously you had to know what parameters to pull together. So when I tried to use these interfaces, not being trained in solar terrestrial physics, I had a very hard time doing it because I just didn't have enough subject matter expertise to actually make meaningful queries. But now I can use it, other people can use it who don't have the same level of training, and you can filter by particular domains, particular instruments. You can see the instrument hierarchy exposed. The scientists really seem to like this. And what it allows them to do is find instruments that make sense for the kind of data that they're looking to capture when they didn't know those instruments existed. So you're finding data that's appropriate for your use case without having to know exactly where it was. There's a lot of different ways that you can see it. Here you can look at instruments on North America. You can choose particular kinds of instruments. I'm not live here, but if I were to click things, I could see the particular kind of interferometers, and then I could capture data based on that. So we're leveraging lightweight semantic technologies, both lightweight ontologies in the background and lightweight kind of Web 2.0 things, tools to enable the next generation of scientific virtual observatory. In another follow-on to this, we didn't make available the provenance when we were providing access to the pictures. So here, the Mauna Loa Solar Observatory is one place that we're deployed, and one of the pieces of data that you might get back are these images of the sun. And these images are actually generated from a whole lot of data sets that are created over many different time periods by a lot of different observers. And sorry again, if you had better eyesight than I do, you could actually see the annotations on this picture about the weather conditions, when this was collected, who collected it, any doubt that they had about the data. And so now the image is actually comes with the provenance. And before, what you actually had to do was you had to go to a handwritten log, if you could get it, or call somebody, if you could find the right person to call, to actually find out what was going on when that data was collected. So this is actually the workflow that actually generates the data that comes from MLSO. And it comes from Hawaii, it goes to places in Colorado. There's a lot of different data managers who actually touch it. And in the old days, you were incredibly lucky if at the end you could get back to the result of one person touching it. Which means that you don't get the data that comes from this person or that person or that person touching it, nor do you get the data that comes from all these processes that actually updated the data. So you're kind of at the mercy of having this data delivered to you. You don't know what actually went on, and so if you're going to try to reuse it, you don't really have enough information to figure out whether it's accurate for your uses without making phone calls or looking up in some kind of paper log. But now what we have is using some background semantic technologies. So we use an expanded version and a slightly modularized version of the VSTO ontology. And we use the provenance ontology from the proof markup language. And in another room we were just chatting about the provenance markups. And we use a data quality ontology to inform the queries. And my display up here just disappeared. And these instruments, instead of just piping out data, they actually pipe out data along with the annotations, some of which are automatically generated, so you know actually a timestamp on when the instrument generated that data. But now also we capture the scene logs and the observer logs along with it. It's back. Thank you. You guys wouldn't see that. Another project that's very new, the Scientific Observations Network. It's just been funded. The kickoff meeting was just a couple weeks ago in Santa Barbara. It's a community-driven effort to have Scientific Observations Network to do semantic interoperability of environmental and ecological data. So the goal is similar to these other areas. We want to have a community-sanctioned evolving data model, in this case for observational data, for ecological and environmental data. We want to build the network of practitioners, and we want to collect a repository of motivating use cases, all to enable interoperability across the resources for environmental and ecological data. And it's leveraging, so there's a website up here that you can go look at for the use case collection and for the starting points. These are the observation models that we're starting from. And we're doing an analysis across them to see which ones make the most sense to reuse. And then from these, we'll actually generate the scientific observations data model that we will use the same kind of methodology, get the science community to vet more and more, and use that to actually share our data. In another project, this one's for you in the back, in another project that's NASA funded, we're trying to help people predict the climate response to a volcanic eruption. So essentially what we want to do is capture enough information of this picture that's provided from NASA about what happens when a volcano erupts, about what goes up into what levels of the atmosphere, what processes happen, what comes down into the portions of the atmosphere that we care about, what might go up further, what happens to the ash. And then we might want to ultimately, so the first problem that we're trying to address here is how do we predict climate response? But other problems we want to predict or help people predict is if you're close to this volcano, when should you evacuate? And what kind of person should you evacuate? Just a person with asthma or any person? And so what we want to be able to do is help them answer the questions that they care about. So this question is one of my favorites because when I first heard it, I said, huh? My role often in knowledge acquisition is to ask the stupid questions and say, you know, what actually is this? So scientists want to answer questions like, determine the statistical signatures of both volcanic and solar forcings on the height of the tropopause. And so if I'm going to instruct a machine on how to answer those questions, I have to understand what this stuff is enough to get it into the machine so that they understand what it is. And better, I actually want to understand why they care. So I asked the guy who generated this question. I said, you know, what does that mean and why are you asking it? And he says, well, I'm looking for bad things. I'm looking for bad things like acid rain in the part of the atmosphere that we experience. And actually more than that, I'm looking to predict when acid rain is going to happen. So I'm going to look for indicators of acid rain. And some indicators of acid rain are statistical signatures. And it's really important in certain areas of the atmosphere, in particular at the height of the tropopause. So that's a little bit of background, but what he actually does is he gives us a whole lot of background. He says, you know, in order to solve this problem, I look at all this stuff. I look at tropical mountains, I look at acidic magma, and, you know, it goes on. But ultimately, we need to figure out what pieces of this we have to capture so that the machine can actually help to figure out when acid rain is going to happen and when the indicators are present or getting worse or getting better. So we need to capture that information in some way. We do it in ontologies. We look at starting points for the ontologies. The Semantic Web, Earth and Environmental terminology is a pretty well used background ontology that's kind of a mid-level science ontology. And so what you see here is portions of suite that have been augmented with basically the terms that you saw, some of the terms on the previous page that help us answer those kinds of questions. And one of the things that I really like about this effort is Suite, when we first started using it, was a monolithic ontology, which if you've been in some of the other sessions, you've heard some people say, those things can be pretty hard to use. So my background, some people call me Ms. Ontology. I've built ontologies for a lot of years and the environments for the ontologies. And I, who am pretty well trained in this kind of stuff, I find it difficult to use these giant monolithic ontologies when, particularly in this case, which is common, this covered much more breadth than I needed, and it didn't cover nearly enough depth that I needed. And so I had to figure, and I'm not an expert in this particular domain, so I need to pull some starting place from somewhere, preferably from something that's got credentials that a lot of the science community likes, but I don't want all that other stuff that's cluttering my brain, saying, you know, what's the definition of this, only to come back 3 hours later to figure out I didn't really need to know that. So as a result of this effort, we actually worked with the authors of Suite, and we ended up helping them modularize it, and now it's a much more modular ontology, and it's seeing much greater reuse. So a couple of highlights from this theme of these 4 selected projects. The background, Semantic Technologies, we used reasoning. They allowed us to do a unified query workflow. So now you can come in any order of the workflow. Also, there's a radically decreased input requirement in many of our evaluations. So we've done evaluations, I think, now for 4 years at the primary science meetings. And they all come back and say, 1, I don't have to type as much. 2, you kept me from making the dumb answers. Basically, once you answer one thing that precludes something else, now the interface doesn't let you make that stupid answer. That uninformed answer, a better way of saying it. So the interfaces only let you do syntactically correct queries, and more importantly, they also, or equally importantly, they let you do semantically correct queries. We have better query support, so that you don't have to put as much in the query because the machine can actually figure out things for you. And we also let you do semantic integration, so you don't have to identify that I want that data set and that data set. I just want the data that's appropriate for my query. So what we did was we used a number of OWL-based tools. We've seen a lot of slides on Protege and Pellet, a reasoner for OWL. And we used some service wrappers to get into the data stores. The primary ones for VSTO are listed here, but we've wrapped other data stores. We used our Inference Web infrastructure for explanation, because one of the things that we found over and over again, that it's, if my smart system gives you an answer, you say, why should I believe you? And by the way, where did that come from? And maybe how recent is it? And is it authoritative? So we're using our Inference Web infrastructure to provide information about where the data came from. And we've found in a number of projects that this basic infrastructure has been extensible in a lot of different areas. So the themes that come back to me as a computer science researcher are all of these efforts and other that came out from other efforts as well, not just the ones that I'm talking about. We have an increased need for provenance. We have radically increased need for community building, vetting, and evolving of the background knowledge, the ontologies. There's also a growing need for linking the data together, and there's more and more need for reuse and things that facilitate reuse, like modularization. So these things actually come back and drive the research that we do on the computer science side and on the semantic web side. So one of the things that I've been leading an effort on Inference Web for a number of years just to make systems actionable. So if I give you an answer, what does it take for you to take action in a reasonable period of time? So not 2 years. To know enough to say, okay, that meets my needs, I'm going to click, or I'm going to buy, or I'm going to integrate. And so our answer to that is knowledge provenance, interoperable knowledge provenance, and infrastructure to support that. So our goals are to provide interoperability, provenance information, explanations in ways that you can consume it, and trust information for both the encoding and for ways of predicting trust. And essentially, this provenance, it can be viewed as another kind of linked data on the web. So our interlingua for that is the proof markup language, which started as a way of encoding reasoners, results of theorem provers. But it's evolved to be a way of encoding information for anything that manipulates data. And while I like PML, I'm one of the co-authors of it, I don't say that that's the only one, because it's clear that there's a number of provenance interlinguas out there, proposed interlinguas, and I'm a member of the newly formed Provenance incubator group coming out of W3C. I think we'll all probably migrate to some, well, I'll ignore that. Oh, it's back. To something that W3C suggests, but it's probably going to have very much of the fundamentals of how do I encode who, what, when, and where? How do I encode how you manipulated what you did to it? What kind of statistical manipulations or sound and complete logical manipulations? And if I trust you and you trust Evelyn, maybe I want to trust Evelyn too, even if I've never met her before, because I trust you so much. So I might want to encode that, and I might want to have algebras for propagating that trust information. It's motivated from a lot of different places, and because of time, I think I'm only going to mention this one, where we're connected with the thousands of problems for theorem provers, where we've got literally thousands of proofs for the same question from a lot of different places. And then somebody might want to say, can I get to this answer different ways? Do some things depend on different sources? Are some of them unreliable? And can some of them be improved? Maybe one's the fast way to get the answer, but it's a horrible way to explain it to somebody, and maybe in other ones the better way to explain it, but it's kind of slow. So it comes from a lot of different settings that we've deployed it in, and we encode it in a background ontology, and it's encoded in OWL, but this isn't really meant for human consumption. This is just meant for machine consumption, so that you can push the provenance around along with the data. So those are the foundations on which we're building this semantic eScience framework. And it's driven by a broad range of use cases, not just for the PhD researcher, but also aimed for the educator. So that actually means that your vocabulary needs to expand, and your presentation style needs to expand, and potentially some of your methods need to expand. It's configuration and profile driven eScience framework, so we need to have domain and design pattern ontology support. We're working on modularization of the domain neutral stuff as well as the domain specific stuff. And actually, we think that it's a significant contribution to have the domain specific stuff in modules as well, because I can't tell you how many phone calls I'm getting from natural scientist X who says, hi, I really need an ontology in. One of the more interesting ones for me was immune epitopes, which I actually had never really heard of. I couldn't have given you a definition when that researcher called me, but I'm now published in a journal of immunology on my ontology of immune epitopes, along with those people, the experts. And we need some set of those ontologies around for people to reuse, so that every person who needs to know something about immunology doesn't have to build their own. So we're working on this domain neutral and domain specific set of ontologies that's open source and community driven. We think that it's really important to push the next generation of knowledge provenance as well. So actually this one is basically VSTO generalized, our interdisciplinary virtual observatory generalized. This one is basically our knowledge provenance infrastructure specialized, because that had no knowledge of the setting that it was in. And we think that it's much more powerful when you have some knowledge. We really want collaborators. The initial collaborators that we're spending more time with are the Marine Metadata Interoperability Effort, SWEET, WHOI, SONNET, the Scientific Observations Network, the Woods Hole Institute, and the Oceans Observing Initiative. And we're actually also using it as the basis of our Semantic eScience class. We're doing a couple of testbed implementations, because one of the things that we found was when we have an implemented system that we make available that has like a simple little use case, people can pick it up, copy it, and then do some implementation in their own domain. And it's a 3-year NSF project that just started literally 2 weeks ago, and 2 advertisements. Consider coming to the International Provenance and Annotation Workshop if you care about the provenance piece. And AI meets linked data, I think, is one thing that's going to be another game changer. So when we use the artificial intelligence along with the massive amount of data that's out there to do a better job of linking it and accessing it, I think we're going to see something equivalent, well, I don't know about equivalent, something interesting like the Wikipedia and the semantic wikis. So with that, so with that, the directions that we're taking is from the increased need for provenance, we're doing the next generation of Inference Web. For growing need for community building, we're doing a lot of work on making semantic wikis more accessible and have more tools to make them more usable. And with the growing need for linked data, we're doing a big play on the data.gov data. And with the growing need for reuse, we're doing ontology modularization and a lot of tools. So with that, I'll open it for questions. I didn't mention that, but really good question. So actually, I had one. I didn't start it, but I ended up owning one of the larger ontology repositories from about 15 years ago when I went to Stanford at the Knowledge Systems Lab. And actually, we were going to do a next generation ontology repository effort, but MMI actually is doing a serious play there. So at the moment, we're supporting them, and if it turns out that it's better to do, we've got provenanceweb.org, because actually I was just at a meeting last week with people saying, marine metadata, you know, that doesn't really capture my notion of environmental X or solar atmospheric Y. So I have a feeling that it'll probably end up moving someplace, maybe to provenanceweb.org, to allow an ontology repository. Because I agree with you, I think the time has actually passed to actually do the next generation of that using today's technology rather than, well, yeah, right. And actually, I guess there aren't too many PhD students in the room, but I think there's room for a couple of theses in there. I mean, I know active work there, but I don't think any existing tool is anywhere close to ready. In fact, when I do a deployed project that's got a critical path, I use standard version control stuff, because I don't think we're ready to do that stuff. But actually, that would be a really good thing for Microsoft to fund.
Another question? When we change speakers, I have a question actually. So these are all big challenges, right? Did you prioritize them there, or what do you think is the biggest, if you have to prioritize?
The biggest challenge, or maybe most important, hardest? What's...
Well, define. You have a list of challenges. How did you...
So I think provenance, actually, so I didn't come to my research life saying I was going to live and breathe provenance. I actually came saying I wanted to do explanation and make stuff more usable. And what I got pushback on was saying, if you don't give me who did it, when, just go away. I don't care how much other work you do. So I think provenance is like the first step to almost everything. And actually, the community enablement. So we've heard that Ben really pushed that in the early talk. And I agree with that as well. So I think we're past the little science. Little science is important. The science that you can do alone, incredibly important. But I think that the way we're going to really make a big change is for everybody in this room working together. So if we can't do the things that enable the next generation of collaboration, we're missing the boat. And I think we've got the tools today that are good enough starting points. So I think it doesn't take my kids or my grandkids to do it. I think I can do it.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.